to my headset, but 1 second.
No problem.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, I'm just going to set my levels here and get my recording going. It's not a whole lot to say that wasn't already said in my email, but I'm working on a story. It's really about kind of hesitancy in young people, and really, Ottawa Morning tomorrow will run a story. It's about a teenager who was hesitant and got their first shot, so it is kind of a positive story.
Oh, good.
But he's just saying how my friends perceive it. This is why people don't do it, and
Yeah.
And what we want to do is kind of expand that out and talk a little bit about
Sure.
what can be done.
There's a larger conversation here about public health messaging in general and the challenges when you're up against cultural forces. We can look back at the smoking campaign, the anti-smoking campaign, for example, which is, of course, an ongoing endeavor, and we've been struggling with this for decades. And one of the biggest barriers to stopping people from smoking is removing the message that it's cool to smoke. And the problem is, it is kind of cool to smoke. It looks cool. Cool people smoke. People in movies smoke. People in magazines smoke. So the wall of industrialized disinformation surrounding the coolness of an unhealthy action is a difficult wall to break through if you're a public health professional. With vaccination, it's not quite as bad because you don't have the well-funded corporate interests actively working against your interests. But you do have these strange cultural forces right now. You've got fairly loud, influential individuals on social media and mainstream media, people like entertainers, even some supposed public intellectuals claiming that vaccination is unnecessary. We'll even talk about the ones who claim it's dangerous. Just simply saying it's unnecessary for a certain segment of the population is bad enough. You can think of Joe Rogan, for example, who has a fairly large audience that dips into the youth, especially young men who see him as a role model for healthy and comprehensive behavior. That's a fairly wide spectrum of interests. And if he says something like young people don't need vaccination, as he has said, that's going to influence a certain segment of that demographic. How do you combat this? I don't know. One strategy is to have counter influencers say the opposite, but that's so obviously what's the word I'm looking for? It's coercive in some ways. It's paternalistic in other ways. It's not organic or natural. Another way is to have counter messaging by other people you trust, supposedly authority figures. It's hard to say. The problem with dealing with young people is that they are always going to be more influenced by their peer groups than by anyone in authority. And your peer groups are going to be influenced by a variety of things. So by the time any sort of external messaging percolates into a social circle, it's going to have a hard time finding purchase in that circle if it's already been seeded by some other kind of thinking. So there is no obvious solution here. One approach is what's called network analysis, where we look at, in a social network, which nodes are the ones that create the most impact. So which member of the peer group has the most influence on everybody else? Maybe it's the queen bee, gaggle of girls, or the head do, the alpha male in a group of boys. Who knows? But an analysis can figure that out, and if you find a way to target that individual, then you have a better chance of penetrating that peer group. A lot of work is done on this. No one's got a solution yet. But it affects so much else, not just vaccination, not just public health. It's the public libraries are uncool in some segments of the youth. So it makes teaching difficult when you send kids to the library to look at something or to look up a reference, and they refuse to go because, quote unquote, only poor people go to the library. With the COVID vaccine messaging, part of the problem is that some of the media has really landed on this message that only those who are comorbid are at risk. So only those who are obese or have heart disease or other kinds of issues, and that's uncool to have those comorbidities. You don't want to be associated with that. Poor people are more likely to have bad outcomes with COVID. No one wants to be poor or be associated with poverty. So all of these traditional divisions in society that we have seen time and time again for other kinds of aspects of social life are just coming to the fore when it comes to vaccination. But the message has to be, you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it to help others. And one thing that has really, prior to COVID vaccination, the single biggest predictor of whether or not a person will accept vaccination is whether they understand that it's for helping other people. Believe it or not, that's a strong motivator for most people. If you tell them this helps other people, not just you, that's going to create a lot of buzz in a certain social circle. So young people in general are far more socially minded than older people. So I think the number of young people who will respond negatively to the idea of this being uncool is actually a vanishingly small group. I think we can reach them with this larger message that it's socially good. You're helping your friends and your parents and your grandparents and the old people down the street, because everybody wants to be heroic, especially young people. And this is a way for them to do so.
Now, so you might have mentioned this, but I didn't hear it. Do you know, like, are rates of vaccine hesitancy higher in young people? Like, do we have any data that kind of bears that out?
Not overtly, but if you look at which groups remain unvaccinated, that's still the under 20s seem to be the largest group that's lacking, which the gap is largest, if I can phrase that correctly. I mean, at a certain level, I'm concerned about that small fraction of the over 50s who remain unvaccinated. What's their story? And they're a bit more intractable than the young people. But the young people are more worrying because they're also the ones most likely to be socializing and the ones who need to gain entry to things like movie theaters and nightclubs and sporting events. So frankly, for that group, this is where the vaccine passport really works well. For a certain, the 12 to 18 group, they're the ones who want to socialize, who want access to these non-essential venues. But yes, in terms of data, I'm unaware of specifically what the hesitancy data looks like, but I am aware that that group is under-vaccinated. And so the gap there is larger than other age groups.
And I'm curious if you have any comments. I'm curious too if this is something, if you hear it at home, if your parents are, hesitant, if they're talking about that, if that's something that you'll absorb as a teenager, and then will be less likely to get a jab.
Yeah, and plus, I still think you need parental consent to be vaccinated. So if they're not going to give it, then you might be out of luck anyway. We do get our marching orders from our authority figures in our life. At some point, though, sometime around the teen years, you stop caring what your parents think and care more what your friends think. But the unvaccinated happen in clusters. They are clustered geographically and they're linked socially. So they're not evenly distributed across the population. So if you find one child who thinks it's uncool, chances are the kids around them also find it an unpalatable thing to do. Whereas you go 2 neighborhoods over and the entire neighborhood there is full of socially minded kids who are very eager to be vaccinated. So there's no common thread that runs through all of this. It happens in clusters, and that's confounded by things like socioeconomic status, the political leanings of the family, who your social groups are, etc.
So okay, those were, I think, all of my questions. So it kind of sounds like we're still trying to crack the nut that is young people. Maybe that's the story of humankind forever.
Exactly.
But there's at least leading theories of maybe the best way.
There are levers that can be pulled, and the vaccine passport is one such lever.
Okay. Well, I'll leave it there. Unless, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you think should be part of this conversation?
No, except that one step more that we can do is to really double down on the messaging to get the risk data out without lying. So I do feel that young people are sensitive to misinformation and to the sense that we are misdirecting or gaslighting them. So it's important to be transparent, even amongst about the low risk of posed by COVID to certain age groups. So I like to phrase it this way, that the risk of something bad happening to a COVID-infected young person is not zero, but it's smaller than amongst older age groups. And the risk of something bad happening if you get vaccinated is also quite low. So how do you balance out 2 low-risk scenarios? What's the tiebreaker? And the tiebreaker has to be this social dynamic, this idea that you're helping other people. So I think we got to push that message. Vaccination is a social responsibility to help other people. We'll get most traction that way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, I'll leave it there. If I have any questions, I might send you another email. But that, I think, really tackles everything I was hoping to.
Great. Sounds good.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Enjoy your Sunday.
Bye.